Thank you very much for coming along. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing carbon tax to combat climate change with Massachusetts Senator Mike Barrett, scientist and activist Gary Rucinski, and Ann Kelly, Public Policy Director of CERES, a nonprofit organization focused on sustainability.
We're graced with a wonderful moderator, first of all, and we should keep Tim in our prayers and offer gratitude to him for that. I'm joined by two wonderful co-panelists today. As I look at the audience, I see people who are really statewide and national leaders fighting climate change, as well as folks perhaps who are new to the idea of a carbon tax. I know that we've got an audience in some ways very accomplished. And so you'll identify with me. I spent the last 18 years in the private sector, although prior to that I had been in politics. But I'd been in healthcare and information technology since 1995 and decided to run for office for the first time in 18 years, 2 years ago. The district in which I wanted to be elected to the state senate is very diverse. The largest place in it is Waltham, 62,000 people. Known as always as a working class city, although it now views itself, and accurately so, as middle class. The second biggest town in my district is Chelmsford, part of Greater Lowell. Chelmsford regards itself as historically as a middle class town, but a very middle class town. A beautiful place that people are very proud of, but not a place that lays claim to great wealth. And then my district goes or ranges from Waltham and Chelmsford all the way up to Weston, the single most prosperous community in Massachusetts according to household income. So the district covered the gamut, and I really decided to go door to door and to find out what people wanted. In fact, I told my supporters, and there weren't too many at the very beginning, they were mostly college kids and high school students, but I said to them, don't talk about me when you knock at the door of voters. No one will have heard from us. We don't need to take a poll. We're going to save money. My name recognition in this area is 0. So don't focus on me. Just ask the people who answer the door, and count yourself lucky when people are nice enough to answer the door. What's the most important thing that you'd like an elected official to work on? Let's learn something in the early going before we worry about publicizing my name. Although, of course, be sure to leave some literature which spells my name correctly. So they did. We all, myself included, my wife, my kids, and these wonderful college interns went door to door in Waltham, Chelmsford, Lexington, Concord, Weston, Sudbury, Bedford, Carlisle, and we said, what is it that you'd really like somebody to work on? And 2 years ago, we heard some things you would expect. People were very concerned about the economy and jobs. Secondly, they were very concerned about the cost of health care. They realized that they were going to get health insurance, that we had health care for all in Massachusetts. They weren't quite sure how their kids were going to be able to afford it, or they were going to be able to. But the thing that really popped, and I'm an environmentalist. I had been very active on hazardous waste issues and clean water issues when I had last served in the legislature in the 80s and 90s. What really blew me away was people's concern about the crazy weather we were having. There was a mandate that wasn't being spoken to very convincingly, very ambitiously, on the part of people saying, do something about climate change. Slow this thing down and reverse it if you can, and adapt to it as the last resort. But really be aggressive, because we are freaked out and we're worried. For me, that was the origins of my carbon tax proposal. I met a colleague of mine, a state representative, Tom Conroy of Wayland. He and I overlap districts. We both represent the town of Sudbury. And I said to him, I really want to go all out on this. We've got to find something that would really make a difference if we could put it across. We considered cap and trade. California had talked about it. But cap and trade really marshals, in the end, the business community behind a relatively complicated but elegant way of inducing companies to produce less CO2. We wanted something that marshaled everybody in the effort. Progressives care about community. The wonderful thing about the carbon tax, so-called, is that all of us are enlisted in the cause. I mean, at its simplest, the carbon tax simply takes a look at every immediate source of CO2, which is the main greenhouse gas leading to climate change, and says, you know what? We're going to put a fee or a levy or a tax to the degree that this fuel, let's say, has the propensity to pollute. So the dirtiest fuel, fossil fuel, is coal. We're really going to tax that. But then we're going to step down the ladder and take a look at petroleum. That's pretty dirty, not as bad as coal, but pretty darn serious. So we're going to slap an intermediate-sized tax on that. We're going to slap a tax on natural gas, the cleanest of fossil fuels by some measures, but still a real danger. And finally, in order to induce people to step down the ladder away from a fossil fuel-intensive world, we're going to tax alternatives, solar, wind, conservation, at zero. As soon as you introduce a differential tax, interesting things start happening, and it's not something that you have to be an economist to appreciate, because we all, at some level, are pretty smart about money. I mean, I am a sometimes watcher of daytime TV. I exercise to daytime TV. I was watching 2 quiz shows today while I was on a treadmill. We all get it, that if you're given a sum of money, and the quiz shows I was watching enabled you to earn a sum of money, and then you saw it drain away as you failed to answer shows put to you by the moderator. Think about a carbon tax this way. At $30 per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, slapped on gasoline, on heating oil, on natural gas, on industrial oil used for fuel, on coal used to generate electricity in power plants. At $30 per metric ton, we'd generate in Massachusetts, we've scoped this out, $2 billion. And that would be differential. So there'd be less tax on X than on Y, depending on how dirty or clean it was. 50% of that distributed back to every household in Massachusetts is $480, as it happens. We've done the calculations. So here's the quiz show question that we're proposing to put to people in Massachusetts. What if we mail you, and we'll do it the way British Columbia, which has a carbon tax, did it. We'll mail you a rebate, because our carbon tax is revenue neutral, in advance, in January of a given calendar year. You'll get a check for $480, representing roughly 50% of the proceeds for a given year's carbon tax collections in a state, given our economy and our population. $480. Now here's the quiz show proposition. If you find a way over the course of 12 months to pay less than $480 in tax because you use a fuel-efficient car, or you use mass transit, or you use a bicycle, or you use a bus, or you put solar panels on your roof, or you insulate your house, or you insulate your business, or you put less energy-intensive lighting into your plant, if you pay less in tax than the $480 as a consumer, you make money. That's the quiz show proposition everybody gets. We want to prompt people, in effect, to ask the question, how can I do something to help with climate change? What can I do in my life that might get me, that might help society as a whole, but might also get me under $480 expended for this new tax the legislature has sought to impose on me? I can, you might say, game the system, and in so doing, make my contribution to reducing climate change impact. State government then gets in the business of helping you figure out how to pay less than $480 in carbon tax over the course of a given 12 months so that you wind up a net winner. There's something beautifully elegant about this in terms of poor people, for example. It turns out, contrary to our intuition, that energy use is somewhat proportionate in this state to wealth. People who have more money do buy bigger cars. They do own bigger houses. Take a look at the McMansions in Lexington. No offense to Lexingtonians in the audience. There's a lot of house and a lot of motor vehicle and a lot of other consumer goods consumed if you have a little more money. If you have a little less money, energy consumption actually is less. despite all the disparities that we could imagine confronting individuals within a given income group. So we've calculated that at $480, the check I received if I were a poor person, I am unlikely to spend $480 in taxes during the same 12-month period that I received my rebate. I'm actually likely to wind up, given fuel consumption patterns, a net winner. There's a progressivity, in other words, about a carbon tax that's very carefully and thoughtfully administered. We don't want to impact the poor. What we do want to do is marshal everyone, poor, middle class, upper middle class, and wealthy, in this cause of saving the planet. So we propose, as I say, to create a kind of quiz show for the social good in which each of us knows if we're an employer, could be Harvard University, or an individual householder, each of us knows we're going to get something back proportionate, because this is revenue neutral, something back, and if we can conserve, we're going to wind up net gainers. If we're profligate, we're going to wind up paying. Now, why do conservatives as well as liberals like this proposition, this sliding scale, this revenue-neutral carbon tax? You know, the conservatives like it because the alternative is top-down regulation. That's what government does. Faced with a real crisis of any kind, we're going to simply impose mandates left and right in a feverish attempt to get energy use down and CO2 emissions down as a consequence. So it's command and control government regulation, or it's this carbon tax notion in which you are in control of when you make the transition to being green. You don't have the means to buy a more fuel-efficient car next year just because the legislature puts a carbon tax on you this year. You're going to have to wait a little, but because your use of a relatively fuel-inefficient car has these externalities, has these external effects, contributes more to pollution than one would have liked, you're going to pay for that externality, that external impact for the first time in terms of this carbon tax, right? And when you're ready, and when you can afford to buy the next automobile, or to transition from automobile to bike, or from a two-car family to a one-car household, when you can afford to make the transition, your tax is going to go down, you're going to save yourself money, you're still going to have that annual rebate or check from the government, you're going to begin to make money on the deal, but at a time of your own choosing. Conservatives like Greg Mankiw, economics advisor to Mitt Romney when he was running for president, an economics professor across the street, like the carbon tax because the market characteristic they see in it is this flexibility to make the move when the business or the individual household is ready to make the move, provided that we pay a penalty because of our pollution impacts in the interim, in the form of greater taxes than we would otherwise pay if we were making greener choices. So there's, again, a little bit of a quiz show here, but in perhaps the most important cause of our age, which is to make sure that the planet remains kind to human habitation and to the survival of all living things. We are very serious about redrafting a carbon tax. We're very interested in what you have to say tonight. I'm very interested in what Ann and Gary have to say and what Tim has to say, because we're drafting a new piece of legislation for January of 2015, assuming I get reelected in November, but it's looking, I'm cautiously optimistic. So we are looking toward a new and improved version that is sensitive to all the conceivable things that can go wrong, or that can, all the laws of unanticipated consequences that would otherwise be visited upon us. We want to anticipate the unanticipatable, make it anticipated, and ensure that we've really got a piece of legislation that works for people regardless of income and regardless of situation. And with that, I've taken too much time. I look forward to hearing my co-panelists, and I want to thank you all for joining us and for helping us out tonight.
Let's hear now from Gary Rucinski, co-founder and activist for the Citizens Climate Lobby. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Cambridge Forum for inviting us here tonight, and Pat Zerke for arranging this great panel that she was able to assemble. I really appreciate the opportunity to come out. I want to get into a little bit, I think Mike gave a great explanation of how this would work at the state level, the importance of injecting this price signal into the economy so that each of us is actually encouraged to go about seeking lower carbon solutions for our energy needs and our lifestyles. I often think along those lines back a couple of years when gas went to $4 a gallon, which is something that we'd of course be looking at in the future when we get a carbon tax. And at that time, people started changing their habits. People started carpooling, people started riding their bikes. A lot of people I know still haven't gotten back in their cars because they found they enjoyed riding their bikes so much. So people do definitely react and respond to price signals in the economy. And that's certainly a big part of what will happen when we have a carbon tax in this state and eventually in this country. But there's another piece to this puzzle, and I relate it to something to my own history in coming to this issue, and that is that during the early part of this century, I was reading a lot about climate change, becoming more and more concerned about it. I happen to have a PhD in particle physics, so I could understand the science that was behind the climate projections that were going on, the effect of CO2 in the atmosphere and how it was driving temperature increases, destabilizing the climate. And so I was reading more about what were some of the advanced effects of climate change, what was going to be happening in the future, and I really became quite concerned about this. I have three small children at the time, and I was concerned for their future. And, you know, in general, the future of mankind. So I began to wonder how I might get involved in this. Well, in 2009, the way I like to put it is, fortunately, I was laid off from my job. And I could have taken that as a very bad omen. I could have been depressed about it. But instead, I thought, this is a great opportunity for me to go off and get a job in the clean sector and start contributing to the solution instead of just being part of the problem. And I had a lot of time on my hands, so I started going to a large number of conferences and clean energy events and networking events. I was talking with regulators, investors, entrepreneurs in the industry. And 6 months into that experience, I wasn't any closer to finding a job than I was at the beginning. And so when I would go to these events at that point, I started asking people, why is it that this industry isn't taking off? There should be so much more hiring than is happening. There should be so much more investment. There should be so many more companies here around Boston where we have these great universities feeding this entrepreneurial spirit that we have. And the answer came back uniformly, and it was, this industry isn't going to take off until we put a price on carbon. And that makes a great deal of intuitive sense. Carbon is cheap. Fossil fuels are inexpensive. All of the infrastructure is already built out. All the fossil fuel companies have to do is dig it out of the ground, put it in the pipeline or on the train. It shows up at our doorstep or at the gas station. And there isn't a lot of investment that has to happen. So they go about optimizing their extraction processes and refining and so on, and they just make it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Whereas the clean energy industry has a huge hurdle to get over, which is to build itself up to the scale where economies of scale start to kick in and prices begin to come down so that they could be competitive with fossil fuels. So fossil fuels have this unfair advantage. They're cheap, they get to pollute for free, and we need a lot of investment on the clean energy side in order to get the clean energy economy that we want. So putting a price on carbon makes a lot of sense. I didn't know at the time how you might do that. You could artificially inflate it, but where would the money go? It wasn't until a couple of months later that I read James Hansen's book, Storms of My Grandchildren, and at the end he suggests going to his website to find out the latest information about what kind of work he's been doing. And there I found a reference to an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby. And when I looked at the Citizens Climate Lobby website, what did I see there except an organization that was laser focused on putting a price on carbon? At that point, I thought I was still a job seeker. But when I saw that Citizens Climate Lobby was working to put a price on carbon, I didn't even have to think about it. Suddenly, I became an activist. And from that moment on, that's what I've been focusing on. I did eventually get a job, as Tim mentioned, at very luckily MIT Lincoln Laboratory. But I became involved in Citizens Climate Lobby. I've been doing their work for the last 4 years. 2 years into that, I became very interested in stimulating the conversation here in Massachusetts around a carbon tax, and so formed Committee for a Green Economy. And now the conversation around pricing carbon is much more robust than it has been, than it had been when David Wilson first proposed pricing carbon and when James Hansen took up the cause. And so at this point, you know, the question is, well, how, as an activist, and watching from within the activist community, how do we actually make this happen? And I'd say that both at the national level, where I have 4 years of experience, and here at the state level, the important thing, obviously, is for everybody who's concerned about this to get involved. Citizens Climate Lobby is, I'm very fortunate to be a part of Citizens Climate Lobby because it's a very well-run, very organized organization. It only has one policy proposal that it's pursuing right now, and that is to put a price on carbon. I would caveat that by saying we may find out that the carbon reductions possible from putting a price on carbon are not going to be sufficient, and we may have to do more. And Citizens Climate Lobby, even though they're focused right now on a price on carbon, once that gets done, if we're still not getting the reductions that we need, then they will move on and work on other policy proposals to make sure that we do get to a sustainable climate. Just like at the national level, where we have a conference once a year where we go to Washington. This year we were there in June. We met with over 400 offices on Capitol Hill on the issue of climate change and putting a price on carbon. We need the same kind of movement within the state of Massachusetts to help Senator Barrett and other legislators who are concerned about doing this at the state level. And make no mistake, the challenge of doing a carbon tax at the federal level is very, very difficult. But in states like Massachusetts, with progressive histories on a whole range of social issues, doing it is well within our grasp. But we will need everybody to speak out on this issue. There's a great organization that's been formed in Massachusetts called Climate Exchange. We have a representative here tonight. You can pick up information in the foyer on your way out. Get involved with them because they'll be driving the conversation and helping get organized around contacting our representatives and state senators, letting them know that we support this happening and accelerating when it can get passed here in Massachusetts. So the only other thing I want to mention, in addition to being involved, is that we have an election coming up in just over a month. It's very important in that election that we get the right legislators back in Massachusetts. And it's also perhaps even more important that we do the same thing in Washington. Citizens Climate Lobby is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. And so we don't endorse candidates. We don't endorse political parties. So I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to name names, if you will. But I will say that there is a party that works, that is part of our system. And there are a couple of things that they do that make it very questionable about whether we will see meaningful climate legislation of any stripe as long as they have significant power. They do things like they reward members of their party who come out and deny the science on climate change. They do things like ask their members to vote again and again and again to strip the EPA of its regulatory power, the only tool we have in our quiver today to address climate change. And so as you as we go through the election season, I ask you to think about this and possibly get involved in making sure that that party's gains are minimized, if not reversed, in this upcoming election. With that, get involved in the electoral process, and then hopefully we'll see success on Senator Barrett's part and at the national level soon thereafter. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Let's hear now from Ann Kelly from CERES, has experience in working on sustainability issues with the business community.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thanks so much for this invitation. It is really an honor to be on this panel with my old friend and teacher, Tim Weiskell, who, among other things, is an expert in environmental ethics and helps us to remember the moral question, which we shouldn't forget as I stand here to make the business case for you. Senator Barrett, enough said, right? With a guy like that, I mean, we can't do any better, and I don't think we can help ourselves to do anything else than get behind his efforts. I'm sure we know how unusual he is, both in our own state legislature and among lawmakers nationwide. And if you don't know, I can tell you. And Gary, one of the co-founders of CCL, I'm a huge fan of the Citizens Climate Lobby. Having been in this movement a very long time, the two bright lights of the last 3 years, the two movements that have broken through, which really command my greatest respect, are the Citizens Climate Lobby for their scale, the singularity of their message, for the way in which they have penetrated through the noise, and 350.org. I saw someone with a t-shirt there, and I really have to give hats off to 350 for breaking through in a really thoughtful and creative way that has made many investors uncomfortable, and discomfort is a very good thing. I do work for CERES, and I just want to clarify my role there. CERES, as you know, some of you may know, was mobilized 25 years ago in the wake of the Exxon Valdez spill. It was organized by some socially responsible investors and environmentalists who really came together to pledge that investors should have more control and engagement over the companies they own. So we developed the CERES principles, the Valdez principles that evolved into the Global Reporting Initiative, and of course, you know the story of the larger corporate sustainability movement. Prior to that, I actually ran the Massachusetts Environmental Strike Force. So just to clarify, I was doing criminal prosecutions. My message then would have been drop a dime on environmental crime. It was very much a we, them, white knight, good guy, bad guy environment, a tremendous amount of fun and energy in those heady days where it seemed so simple to enforce the blunt tool of criminal law and to try to, put people in jail. That became, it lacked a certain nuance, although there was a righteousness about it, and the undercover work, and we used to have students come from Harvard to help us. I went to CERES, became a sort of a mediator to do something a little more nuanced, which CERES is committed to mobilizing investors and companies on the broader sustainability challenges. I mobilize companies and investors in particular around advocacy. I'm a federal registered lobbyist, so most of what I'm doing is working from Capitol Hill. I was asked, I really just want to throw out a few thoughts, really just a few threads, and we'll see what you pick up on, because you've been kind enough to come here on a rainy night when I understand that Nicholas Kristof is speaking at Memorial Church. And I was told before this panel that we were going to flip the Harvard lecture and have most of it be about you. So I'm going to be very brief. I think there are some important trends to note and events, just to give this a little bit of context. In particular, just talking about 350 and the divestment movement for a moment has had a huge impact in our world as we work with investors. CERES has an investor network on climate risk that has over $10 trillion of assets under management, includes now over 100 investors. So that small group of SRIs has really grown to include major asset managers and pension funds and others. And I would say that while CERES model is all about engagement and investing, the divestment movement has really forced some important questions and important conversations. And I've been at more than one conference among investors at Bloomberg and elsewhere where people have said, what is with these 350 folks? All my clients are calling me asking us to have a fossil-free portfolio. What is going on? In addition, it spurred a question about carbon asset risk, and many of you probably know about the carbon asset risk questions, which have been raised by HSBC and others, where investors, in particular, many of our investors, have written to fossil fuel companies, confronted them with the notion that their assets are essentially overvalued. Right? They're overvalued because many of those assets are in the ground and can never be burned or used if we are to stay within the 2-degree limit. So it's forced a vital conversation between the investors and the companies in which they own or have relationships to say, well, what are you doing about this asset risk? And why are you continuing to spend $674 billion a year looking for new reserves, when actually you could put out a dividend, or you could be researching alternative forms of energy, or all the answers that you know so well. So that's a vital conversation that I think we really owe the divestment movement to, and I won't go on. You know how successful that movement has been. If that's a thread people want to pick up, we can certainly talk about it. 1,100 companies have signed a climate declaration that declares that tackling climate change is one of the greatest economic opportunities of the 21st century. Now, I made a laminated copy, yes, for at least the top 90 or so. I call that kind of a gateway drug for advocacy, to enshrine the notion that there's actually economic value associated with solving the problem is important. Many of those companies come from Midwestern states and various parts of the country where saying the word climate change, unfortunately, is still toxic. To marry the notion of there's money in solving this problem is not insignificant. 638 companies across the country have established an internal carbon tax, an internal carbon fee within the corporation as a way to understand how that would work in a larger jurisdiction. Probably the best example is Microsoft, and if you want to know how they did that, they've put out a carbon fee playbook that really walks other companies through that process. So that would suggest that it's a shorter leap to actually get to a place where we could have a public jurisdiction establish a fee, and as you know, several jurisdictions have done so. We have a president who gets it. It's not irrelevant that on June 2nd, he put out the rules, the carbon pollution standard, which would cut carbon from power plants and do more than any nation has ever done to cut carbon pollution. Pursuant to the Supreme Court case, Massachusetts versus EPA, that we all know went through in 2007. So yes, it took a while. But we shouldn't ignore the fact, when we think that Washington is broken and that nothing is going on, we really have to stop and give credit to the administration, our own Gina McCarthy and Janet McCabe, both who come from Massachusetts environmental departments, for really putting this through in a thoughtful and creative and flexible way that allows various states to take into account their own existing energy portfolio in coming to a reduction of carbon. It's important for several reasons. One, it's going to cut carbon. Two, it's sending an important price signal to investors about the future of coal and other fossil fuels. Three, back to Senator Barrett, he just made an important point about just how much people love to hate regulation. Businesses and investors in particular. I used to work at EPA, and I know how much people, the business community often hates regulation. We had 175 businesses and investors stand up on June 2nd when the president came out with his rules and say, yes, it's time. Let's get this done. In particular, 3 major power companies stood up 1 hour after the rules came out, and they are the folks who really have their necks on the line and said, yes, it's time. This is going to be in transition, this is going to be an adjustment, but it's time to get it done. The final reason that rule is important is because it forces the conversation we're having tonight. Because the distaste for regulation is so visceral and so deep and so profound that it's actually prompting a really practical conversation about the possibility of a carbon tax. People don't like taxes, but they really dislike EPA regulation, which, by the way, makes no sense because we're all here breathing. And if you've been to China lately, you're grateful for our beloved Clean Air Act, passed unanimously by the Senate on December 31st, 1970, but who's counting? So it's really prompting an interesting discussion that I'm finding happening in a post-partisan way. So tonight, I'm here to publicly pledge to get the business and investor interests in Massachusetts behind Senator Barrett's bill, in part because it's the right thing to do. It's also the most productive post-partisan conversation that we can have. Many of you may know of Senator Bob Inglis, former senator from South Carolina, who lost his job to a Tea Party candidate for 2 reasons. 1, he said that we thought we should do something about climate change. And 2, he said that he didn't hate President Obama. He's done his work now at George Mason University, and he has called for what he calls trans-tribalism. That's another way of saying post-partisan. Another strand of the conversation we could talk about, which no doubt Gary is fluent in, is how do we get this done? You all know about the partisan divide in Washington. We know about the us and them nature of this conversation. What I like about what Senator Barrett has put forward is that it changes this to a fiscal conversation, which is more where CERES does our work in the business and investor community. And I'm finding behind the scenes, if you go behind the headlines and go behind all the terrible things we read about Congress, you talk to individual staffers on Capitol Hill, there are some pretty constructive conversations going on about a revenue-neutral carbon fee. Bob Inglis always tells me, Ann, don't say tax, whatever you do, don't say tax. You know, that makes Republicans go into shock. You've got to say a revenue-neutral carbon fee. The final reason I'm going to support Senator Barrett's bill is because it's sponsored by Senator Barrett. And the first meeting I went to on Beacon Hill, where he got up to talk about this, I was really struck not only by his precision in how he understood how the tax code works and how he understood how it would affect people, and that he understood that the only way to get massive support would be to make it revenue neutral. But he also really understood how hard it was going to be. We're talking taxes, right? Just how difficult, just how much we were going to have to put our shoulder to the wheel to get this done, just how much we were going to have to mobilize and be really thoughtful and listen carefully to the opposition or the other side. I was struck by that. Did I mention that he said it was going to be hard? He said it was going to be really hard, but I found that really motivating, and he was not at all naive about the stakes and what we're up against. So I really look forward to working with all of you, working with Senator Barrett and the coalition and his staff as we try to mobilize folks around a state carbon tax. One reminder, just to remind you about your environmental law history, all environmental laws start at the state level. It isn't cliche at all to talk about Brandeis's quote about the states being the laboratories of experimentation. That's always how it happens. So as much as I completely support the Citizens Climate Lobby, and what a thrill for me to walk into a senator's office and ask for a little tax subsidy for the production tax credit for wind, and for them to say, well, we would support a carbon tax, you know. Do you know CCL? And I said, yes, I know them. I know them. They call me 3 times a week. They are so persistent. That's progress. That's breakthrough. It's small. But I feel like if we can pass this in Massachusetts, that we could be really a model in a smart state that gets it, that has an energy portfolio that makes it perhaps a little easier for us to do it here with the leadership and the brilliance of Senator Barrett. I believe we can get this done, and I look forward to your questions.
Hi, my name's Kevin Block-Schwenk. I'm an economics professor at Berklee College of Music. I thank you for doing this. It's a pastime, and I'm glad somebody's doing it. I do have just one question as far as the business side of it, which is, of course, some decent fraction of our electricity is produced outside Massachusetts, and similarly, a lot of our products are produced outside Massachusetts. My back-of-the-envelope calculation is that this is going to add in the order of 10 to 20% to the cost of energy. So I was just wondering if there's some way to account for, you know, our business and stuff which is paying this extra fee and others which are not from out of state.
I'm sorry, could you just repeat the question?
Sure, I'm basically wondering, is there going to be the equivalent of a tariff, or for example, is a cement manufacturer in state going to be paying the fee, and somebody who brings their cement in from out of state gets to avoid the fee?
You're making, first of all, thank you for a great question. I know my co-panelists are going to have things they want to say as well. This is Senator Barrett, and you're indirectly making the case for where we want this carbon tax idea to ultimately go, which is national. We know Massachusetts is capable of taking the lead, but we also know that this idea works best when cement manufacturers in Pennsylvania and cement manufacturers in Massachusetts face the same costs of production. So our intention here right from the get-go is to make this work for a single state, but propagate it then throughout New England, then throughout the Northeast using RGGI as a possible model, and then eventually we hope throughout the rest of the country. It would be nice if eventually many advanced industrialized countries as well as some developing nations all put a price on carbon, which is causing the climate of the planet to escalate. Your immediate question, to address your immediate question of what we do in the interim, we're proposing to put this tax effectively on fuels rather than on products, primarily because the mathematical calculations are so tough. I can't tell you how much carbon went into making my Apple computer, my monitor, my keyboard, and my mouse. So I'm not proposing to slap a carbon tax on computer products at the moment, or for that matter, on the products of the life sciences industry in Massachusetts, or on concrete either. We're really proposing to tax energy use, and of necessity, we can only tax, Professor, energy use within Massachusetts. So there is a problem of external effects of that sort, but the answer ultimately is to start small and then grow bigger, and to make sure that energy use anywhere in the country and then eventually in adjoining countries is taxed as well. I can tell you this, and this is somewhat counterintuitive, this does not hurt Massachusetts business. There's an odd thing about the carbon tax. This actually leads to a net gain in jobs in Massachusetts. So before we start worrying too much about that cement manufacturer in Massachusetts, let me tell you that there's something odd going on here. Massachusetts imports energy, as you indicate. So imports it whether it's electricity or primarily electricity, which is generated off-site. When we spend money to buy electricity generated using coal or petroleum in some other state and sent to Massachusetts over interstate transmission wires, we're shipping money out of state. And we're providing employment. Someone's generating that electricity and extracting that fossil fuel out of the earth, but it's not happening in Massachusetts. So effectively, we're shipping money out of state and we're supporting employment out of Massachusetts. Here's the economic effect of taxing something that we import, like energy. We use less of it. We try to avoid the tax. We engage in tax avoidance, in this case, as a social good. If you tax electricity in the way that you're suggesting, and we find ways over time to use less of it by putting a solar panel on the house or simply by turning off the lights a little more conscientiously, in the end, more money remains in our pocket. We will be consuming fewer kilowatts in the house or in the business. What do we do when we spend less on energy because it's so expensive we want to avoid consuming it? Well, the economists can tell us what we do. Most of us don't invest in the stock market. We turn around and we spend it at the supermarket. And so it turns out that if you consume less energy imported from another state or from abroad, you do have more disposable income, and most of us turn around and spend it on things that are produced locally. We've done an extensive model of the carbon tax on the Massachusetts economy. We hired a consultant to do this. The net impact, given that we have relatively few energy-intensive industries and a lot of importing going on, the net effect at $30 per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent or emitted is that we create 7,000 more jobs in the state, all in the form of less imports in the form of energy and more redirected spending on local job-creating activities: the supermarket, the coffee shop, the movie house, the restaurant, the clothing retailer. And I'm sorry to be so long-winded in answering your question.
Yes, sir.
My name is Roger Schamel of the Global Warming Education Network, and I'm proud to have had Mike Barrett as one of my representatives. Concord and Lexington led the American Revolution, and it appears they'll be leading the American energy revolution, which is wonderful. My question is for Gary, I think. Climate change is a very serious issue, as you all know, and I'm happy for what you're all doing. But we might only have a few years till we reach some tipping points, and so I'm wondering, will the carbon tax be enough, and at what level? That might be a question for Mike. And how fast might it ramp up? And for Gary, you mentioned that the Citizens Climate Lobby had other things in mind. I wonder if you'd care to share those with us.
This is Gary Rucinski. We know at Citizens Climate Lobby, our goal is to develop the political will for a sustainable climate. The use of the carbon tax, the revenue neutral carbon tax, as the first policy issue that we've latched on to, is one that is helping to keep us focused, keep us organized, and keep us driving towards a common goal. We deliberately shy away from taking on other issues or other challenges because we know if we were to do that, we'd begin to dissipate the concentration and the focus of the organization. But ultimately, again, our goal is for a sustainable climate. When you look at some of the numbers around what happens when you implement a carbon tax, in British Columbia, where they have a carbon tax that's about equivalent to what Senator Barrett has been talking about, they have reduced carbon emissions by something on the order of 17% over 4 or 5 years. That's not enough to avoid the tipping points. In fact, we already know from the Antarctic studies that there's one tipping point that we've passed unknowingly some years ago, and now we're committed to at least 4 and probably 10 feet of sea level rise. With the study of Massachusetts that we had commissioned for Committee for a Green Economy, that study also showed a reduction. If you took the carbon tax up to $45 a ton, you would get a reduction of about 10 percentage points off of the 1990 baseline, and where we really need to be is at 10 or 5% of the 1990 baseline. So the carbon tax isn't going to be enough to get us there quickly enough. And it's funny because last night I was on a national conference call where the executive director of Citizens Climate Lobby sort of rhetorically asked the question, you know, people ask him all the time, what are you going to do after you pass the carbon tax? And I often tell people, well, then we're going to go back and fix the carbon tax that got passed because who knows what it's going to be. But there are other things, and as an activist and as somebody who wants to pass on a sustainable climate, in fact, my goal, my personal goal, is to actually see the atmospheric concentration of CO2 come down, not only flatline, but come down in my lifetime. And there are other things that we need to do. One of the things that I'm involved with is I'm on the advisory board of an organization called Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. This is an organization that talks about restoration of ecosystems, some of which, like grasslands, have the potential for sequestering huge amounts of carbon. In fact, calculations show that we could reduce atmospheric concentration by 50% of the legacy load, the excess over the pre-industrial level, if we simply manage rangelands properly. So I think that, you know, 2 things will come into play. One is there's a lot of thinking going on in terms of what else we need to do biologically in ecosystem restoration, carbon sequestration, and so on. The other thing is, again, Massachusetts isn't a very big lever when it comes to having national or global scope on reducing emissions because our economy is relatively small compared to that of the United States as a whole and so on. But if we can blaze the path here and get this passed, when we get it passed at the federal level, I know from the entrepreneurs and investors that I met when I was off networking that there's a lot of pent-up energy, there's a lot of pent-up ideas, there's a lot of pent-up money waiting for this signal. And the history of business responding to environmental regulation and changes of this sort has always been that before passage, it was going to be impossible to meet and it was going to take a long time in any event. And the reality has always been it happened much quicker and much more cheaply than anybody anticipated. And frankly, I'm excited. If we can get, when we get a federal carbon tax passed and when this begins to proliferate virally around the globe, because other countries will do it as soon as the world's largest economy does, we're going to see things that none of us can think of today, because there's just going to be so much more creative energy put forward to solve this problem. And we'll avoid as many tipping points as we possibly can.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Ann, do you want to?
Well, I would just add, this is Ann Kelly, that I think we all understand it's going to take many, many different actions at once. And in addition to a carbon tax, we need to continue to regulate carbon, as the carbon pollution standard will do. We also need to increase the investment into renewable energy. We need to reduce the cost of capital. There is all sorts of money on the sidelines that needs to be invested in renewable energy. So there's, I think, a multiplicity of events that need to happen at the same time. But I completely agree with Gary that the price signal that is sent by a tax will spur all kinds of other action and innovation.
Roger, I'll just add, as Senator Barrett here, that if once we summon the political will to enact this different set of choices for each one of us in the state and in this room, that tax can go as high as the public will permit it to go, but no higher than the public will permit it to go. So we've got to continue to build public support. It can be over time, if you can help us generate real commitment to pushing back climate change and global warming, we'll set the refundable fee at the level that works. But we are in a democracy, so we're not going to impose this without some kind of public receptivity, and that's elastic, and so is the levy.
Hello. My question is primarily for Senator Barrett. I'm in favor of anything we can do to combat climate change, including a carbon tax. But my concern is I'm a renter, and my home is heated with fuel oil. I do what I can to conserve it, but I have absolutely no choice about how I heat my home. And if I'm not mistaken, there are more renters than homeowners in Massachusetts. So the people who are making the decision about the energy use are not the people who are paying for it. So as you're considering ways to improve the bill, if you can think of a way to address that disconnect, that might go a long way to having it make more of a difference.
Thank you very much. And we're doing a lot of thinking about the ways to make the tax both fair and to incentivize all of us to change it. Most of the energy use in the state of Massachusetts doesn't go to heating your apartment or your home. Residential heating is important. Commercial heating, very important. Transportation is actually the biggest chunk of this. So we would say to renters, first of all, that we're going to continue to think about ways to refine the approach. But all of us consume a great deal, and here's the good news. If you're a renter in the city and you use public transportation or your bike, remember, we're going to send you, the state is going to refund this tax to the degree that it collects. So if we collect $2 billion in Massachusetts because of a carbon tax, we're going to distribute it back to business, we're going to distribute it back to nonprofits, and distribute it back to consumers and voters. You're going to get your $480 check. If you're using the T, if you're using a bike, if you're not totally reliant on a car to get around, you're not going to be paying a lot of this tax, and you're going to wind up a net winner, and we like that because effectively you're living green, and you should make out under a refundable scheme of this kind.
If I could, this is Gary. I completely sympathize with the position you would find yourself in. And I know that it's an uncomfortable prospect to think that your landlord doesn't care about how much you have to pay for your heating oil. Over time, and Senator Barrett's bill does in fact ramp this tax up over time. It's not something that just hits in the first year and then we're stuck with it. I believe it starts at 5 and goes up by 10 a year. And so that's meant to give the economy time to respond. Now, just like somebody who has to commute by car to work every day won't immediately face financial hardship because of this tax, and over time, as their car ages, when it comes time to swap out their car and buy a new one, there will be more options on the market, first of all, for higher fuel efficiency vehicles, and they'll be able to take advantage of that. The same thing is going to happen, although at a somewhat different scale, for renters for apartments and homes. In fact, I was meeting with somebody just before the event tonight who's building a passive energy apartment complex in downtown Boston. So those options will become available, number one. Number two, landlords who decide not to do anything with their buildings will pretty soon find themselves out of a market, because people will make, okay, 5 years, 10 years down the road. Again, I know a home is somewhat different than trading in a car, but the price signal will seep through the economy, and everybody who is participating financially in the markets will be incentivized to start making changes. Otherwise, if their businesses continue to be carbon intensive, their prices are going to be higher relative to those who are getting on the bandwagon and moving to the renewable and high energy and conservation strategies.
And I would just encourage you and all renters to look into green leases. So a green lease is a new model that allows landlord and tenant to split the cost and the savings associated with energy savings measures. And I think we're going to see a proliferation of those.
I'm Fred Small. I'm the senior minister at First Parish in Cambridge Unitarian Universalist, this church. And it's so appropriate that this conversation is happening here because climate is a moral issue, as Anne referenced. And it's a moral issue because climate change is theft from future generations and from the most vulnerable people on the planet. I'm very excited by the conversation. I think you've made a very compelling case for carbon fee and dividend. But we know that political decisions are not made because the policies proposed are good or because a rational case is made. For instance, there's this bottle bill expansion that has been stuck in the legislature for decades, and perhaps we will have the good sense to pass it come November, notwithstanding the extraordinary sums of money being spent by the beverage industry. And you also said this is going to be hard, and I think you're exactly right. So I would like to ask the panel a strategic and tactical question. I want to know how we're going to get this done, because it will be hard. Where are the community organizations, the trade unions, the churches, the communities of faith? Who is going to pull all this together and mount a lobbying campaign that is going to overcome the resistance that is there? How is that going to happen? Show me the path to victory and tell me how we can get involved.
Thank you, Fred. And by the way, I remember when the Reverend Fred Small was a folk singer right here in Cambridge. I went to his concerts, and for that matter, I went to listen to music at the Nameless Coffee House in the basement of this church in the late 1960s. So I've been a Fred Small fan for a long time, and am very happy to be back in a church that he leads so ably. You know, the story from Massachusetts isn't that distressing or depressing. It is true that we failed to move some bills that should move, but we've also, as a legislature, we've tended to bite the bullet, specifically on the hardest political issue that one can imagine for an elected politician, and that's taxes. We, in fact, took a look at eroding roads and bridges, and within the last 12 months, I should say it was about a year ago now, in the early months of 2013, responding to a good governor who proposed to raise the gas tax. You know, the gas tax is a tax on a fossil fuel. It is a carbon tax. It's not a complete carbon tax system. It is very, very tough to raise the tax on gasoline because all of us feel it and we say, ouch. And even those of us who want to be green protest that we got to use that car to get to work and this is going to make it more expensive. Despite all of that, the legislature was very respectful of citizen pushback, but voted to raise the gas tax because the case for spending the money well on roads and bridges that create lots of jobs. Now, all of us are incredibly irritated, aren't we? Because we can't go anywhere without meeting road construction as we speak. I mean, trying to get around my district because of the amount of road improvement activity going on is a pain in the neck. That's your tax money at work, and it is being put to work. It's not going into the pockets of politicians. The painful vote to raise the gas tax demonstrates that when the sense of crisis reaches a certain fever pitch, politicians will do an unpopular thing. So, and they will do it even if the church, and in that particular case, and I want to express gratitude here, the churches and the community organizations, by and large, were supportive of the gas tax, even though they're very concerned about the impact on poor people. The business community supported the gas tax. I sat down last week with Paul Guzzi, the president of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce. I had seen him the day before, which is to say last week, on television here in Massachusetts, and what was he doing? He was the star performer in a press conference that said, don't repeal the automatic escalator in the gas tax to account for inflation. In other words, let the gas tax go up every year if the cost of doing business goes up. Why was he in favor of a tax? Because he cares about roads and bridges. The challenge for everyone tonight, and everyone listening to this broadcast, and everyone on this panel, is to make everyone in the state and the country concerned about climate change, whether they're business people or church people or labor organizers. I think we can do that because I think the problem is pressing enough, and what choice do we have ultimately but to insist that we succeed?
That was such a great question. I appreciate Senator Barrett's comment. I would just remind us that the law is a lagging indicator of progress. The law is a latecomer in a democracy. It's the product of consensus, or as Senator Barrett just said, the public reaching a fever pitch. So let's look elsewhere for indicators of progress, first off. And also, you point out that Massachusetts has in fact stood out, specifically in the environmental arena, apropos of the first speaker's question, standing out with more stringent laws that could arguably have had an economic effect on the state, having the strongest Wetlands Protection Act in the country, for example. And I think we have a proud legacy of being willing to raise the level of our ambition in that regard. How do we get it done? And it's an honor to be with you, Fred Small. I too remember your music, and I didn't realize you were in the audience, so this is a real treat. I think we have to really stratify the movement and be very clear as we think about a movement, who's doing what, and not all of us will do the same thing. So I indicated earlier I used to do criminal enforcement. I think we need a very strong enforcement. We need a very strong radical element to this movement, and whether that's 350 or another group, I think it's really important for a group to keep the pressure on very, very strong. We need other people who are willing to be bridge builders and crossover types, who don't think in terms of us and them, but really think in terms of we, and will really reach out to those with whom they disagree to try to build bridges. And I think in this particular topic, it's quite easy to do that. You mentioned unions. We absolutely have to talk candidly about the necessity for a labor transition. And we can put ourselves in the shoes of all the many families who, third, fourth, fifth generations, have lived on coal. And, you know, what did coal give us? What did coal give our ancestors? It's a hard question. It gave them warmth and light when they needed it most. Now, I don't love coal. Of course, I think it needs to end. But I think as activists, we have to really think pretty carefully about the labor questions involved, and are we being thoughtful about the necessary transition? The coal industry hasn't treated its own workers well. We know this. But let's think carefully about when we demonize a particular industry and without thinking about its potential victims. So some group of us needs to be thinking about that. Some group of us needs to work closely with the business and investor community. I think a group of us needs to work closely with the faith community, which is, I think, unstoppable. And thankfully, Kelsey Worth and others have organized mothers, which have historically had a real role to play. So let's admit that we have different approaches, and let's stay in our lane and really have a movement that puts different people in different roles and doesn't all try to be in one mess. And my final comment is, if anyone was there on the streets of New York last week as those 400,000 people not only marched together but became silent on 6th Avenue, in that moment, and then when the huge cheer arose, you knew in those few nanoseconds that we were going to actually solve the problem. And it wasn't because we were all the same. It was many, many different movements interpreting this problem in many, many different ways, but in that moment collectively being about the solution.
And I'd like to comment, this is Gary, and Fred, it's good to see you again. You know, with respect to Citizens Climate Lobby, how are we going to get this done? We're going to do it. We are focused on applying constituent pressure. So we try to have chapters in every congressional district around the United States. We currently have representation in over 80% of districts around the United States, which means that when it's time for us to have a meeting with a senator or a representative, we have a constituent who can make that call and set that meeting up for us. And offices are very willing to set those meetings up because of a constituent is asking. Now, when we go in and meet with a senator or a representative, as Ann was referring to, we go in with an attitude of respect, gratitude, and admiration. We meet people where they are. We talk with the best and the biggest climate champions in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, and we talk with the biggest denialists in the Senate and the House of Representatives. But we meet them where we are. We don't go in and beat them about their head and shoulders, trying to convince them that they ought to immediately jump to our side. We go in and we find out what are their concerns and what are they thinking about, and do they see any impacts from climate change? Are their constituents concerned about it, and so on? We have a very systematic process for dealing with popular support, generating popular support, and also generating support in our office holders. And that is that we look at this and we think, we've got 4 levers that we've got to work with. One of them is lobbying, where we're going in and talking directly. Another is working with the media. Another is doing outreach, like this event tonight. And a fourth is actually developing ourselves. So we work with those 4 levers. If the lobbying lever is stuck, we go and work somewhere else until we can get the lobbying lever unstuck by applying more constituent pressure, by working with the media and bringing more pressure that way, whatever it takes. So Citizens Climate Lobby is just going to keep banging away at this thing from the standpoint of dealing directly one-on-one with our representatives and senators. We're going to do our best to move this issue on Capitol Hill. I think that Climate Exchange here in Massachusetts will do the same with Beacon Hill. And you know, really what I see happening here in this model, and I think that this goes well beyond the climate change model with what Citizens Climate Lobby is doing, is it's offering a new model for how concerned citizens can get involved with their democracy. And I think that you're going to see over the coming months and years, as we get success on this issue, that people are going to recognize that this is a very important model. And some of the other social issues that we're dealing with could yield to this same approach. I view this as sort of the rejuvenation of participatory democracy at this point. And with respect to other organizations, Fred, I will come and talk with any organization you can provide me an introduction to and try to explain to them what we're trying to do, find out where they are, and hopefully educate them and improve their understanding and acceptance of what we need to do going forward.
Thank you, Gary. Go ahead. Next question.
I'm Mike Ferreter. I'm a member of Citizens Climate Lobby in 350 Massachusetts. Thank you for the opportunity of speaking to you. Thank you guys for being here and addressing this with us. My question is, would one of the panel members please explain to me how government subsidies for fossil fuels have kept renewable energy sources from being competitive?
Yeah, this is Ann Kelly. There's a great white paper on this topic called "What Would Jefferson Do?" It's by Nancy Fund. She's an investor, and it's a history of energy subsidies, and she lays it out beautifully. I'm happy to provide a link, which basically, as your question suggests, outlines the profound inequity and unequal playing field for fossil fuel energy sources versus renewable sources. I mentioned earlier that my office has worked for the production tax credit for wind. It's a small subsidy. We have to go back and lobby for it every 2 years. Then it dies out. We're pushing for it once again. There's a subsidy, the ITC, for solar. There's going to be a new technology-neutral subsidy. But needless to say, we know about the profound disproportionality of fossil fuel subsidies. And along with that portfolio of initiatives that we were referring to earlier, and there's a long list, by the way, in addition to a carbon tax, we absolutely need to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. And the sooner we can do it, the better. I wish it were simple. It's not. If you know anything about the tax code, it's enormously complex, but we absolutely have to get it done. And I applaud President Obama again for standing up for that early in his term. There just simply has not been the congressional will to get that done.
Is there anything we citizens can do to assist in removing those subsidies?
Yes, I think it should be a part of every political narrative, every single pitch. I appreciate what Gary's saying about the singularity of the CCL approach, and I think it's actually working. However, in every conversation, I think we have to say eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. It has to be a baseline. So we need to find as many opportunities as we possibly can to make that part of our legislative ask.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much. I'm Michael Charney. I live in Cambridge, and I want to thank the Senator for putting forward the bill. Approaching or addressing the issue of opposition and how one rallies both the people and local legislators and local governments to support the effort and help overcome the opposition we can expect, I gather, from the fossil fuel industries. There is the windfall that you talk about of the upfront $480, and I wonder if there's any way that there might be a check-off box or something to funnel some of that money into local governments or into local funds, either for education on energy and climate issues or for funding local projects, energy efficiency and conservation projects, town by town, that would engage local town councils and so forth and leadership to get behind this. I don't know how popular it would be among the electorate who might very much want to pocket the 480, but it might be that there's a significant percentage and there could be a competition among citizens to support their local community by pledging and having a place supported by the bill to conveniently channel that money in a productive way that would incentivize local support.
Thank you. Excellent question. Senator Barrett here. The most complicated aspect of the carbon tax to get your head around, your question beautifully pinpoints it. It's this question of revenue neutrality. It's a hot topic among those of us who have debated carbon tax, but it's also a complicated idea, isn't it? The citizen sitting out there in her home hears that government proposes to tax sources of pollution to the degree that they pollute, And then here's that government proposes to turn around and send back all the money it's just collected through a carbon tax back to the citizenry. And the citizen might well ask, well, what's the point of that, of closing the loop in that way? Why tax me in the first place if you're just going to turn around and give me all the money back? What we have to convey to people is that up front, we want to, again, think about the game show on daytime TV. We do want to put a price on pollution because the climate is burning up. So we do want to tax each of our choices, or we want to, I should say, we want to put a price on each of our choices that might lead to more pollution. And we've got a way of doing that. But not because we want to spend the money in any particular fashion. That's a second question that Michael's query to us just now goes to. There's a value in taxing pollution that's quite separate from the value of what you do with the money you collect. What the economists will tell you is that if you put a price on a decision that you make to go relatively smart and green or to choose the higher polluting alternative, if you put a cost to choosing the higher polluting alternative, most of us are going to get it. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. We understand if you make choice A more expensive for me, that over time I'm going to go to choice B. So we're aligning incentives here even before we get to the question of what we do with all the money we collect. We're aligning incentives because, in a sense, we want the public to engage in tax avoidance. We want people to avoid the tax that goes with the higher polluting car, the higher polluting house, the higher polluting appliance, and we want people over time to decide that they're going to dodge the tax, as it were, and go with the greener choice, but at the timing of their own choosing, because we respect that not everybody can make upfront investments overnight. The question that you ask gets to part two of the problem. Once the state government collects a whole bunch of money by taxing pollution, by taxing or by putting a price on carbon, what should we do with the money? And let's talk real politics on this part of the issue. We've done some polling on what the public thinks about paying a tax on its pollution choices. And the public is ambivalent, is struggling with this, but increasingly opposes it if they think this is just a pretext for making government bigger rather than an opportunity to save the planet. There's a lot of anti-government feeling out there, and so you actually need to divide one's analysis in two. People are willing to do something to avert climate change. Does it have to mean that we would grow the net size of government and increase total tax collections? What the polls show is that support for saving the planet goes down if incidentally it's going to make state government or federal government that much bigger. That's why we arrived at this notion of revenue neutrality, because we are seeking to divide the question. We are trying to get you to make the lower taxed choice, the lower polluting choice, and then we basically say to you again, look, once we incentivize all of us to make wiser choices for the world and for our kids, the question of what we do with the money is a complicated one. What I've decided to do as a legislator here in Massachusetts is to give it all back. But here's the way the logic works, remember. If I give it all back to you equally, and it does happen to work out to $480 per taxpayer at $30 per metric ton of carbon tax, if you get your check for $480, again, and you choose to buy that high polluting vehicle or that energy wasteful home, or you still don't want to turn off your lights at night, that $480 isn't going to cover the tax that you're going to wind up paying. You're going to be a net loser. But your neighbor living in the same kind of house who puts solar panels on the roof or buys a different car or turns off those lights is going to get his or her $480 but pay less in tax because over time she's decided to make wiser choices. We've decided to give the money back because up front we want to motivate all of us to make smarter, choices in terms of climate change. We could have gone another route. We could have said, you know, we're going to have an income tax in Massachusetts, property tax in Massachusetts, sales tax in Massachusetts, all needed to, and we do fund good energy conservation programs for cities and towns with that money. But now we're also going to have a carbon tax for Massachusetts, and we're going to fund more programs. I can only tell you, life isn't fair, some of you will be thinking. I can only tell you that I can't pass a carbon tax that promises to increase the total amount of money that government takes out of your pockets. I have a harder time getting the votes. I can't get it done. A revenue-neutral carbon tax, once people understand that British Columbia actually did this. British Columbia is roughly the size of Massachusetts in terms of its provincial economy up there in Canada. It's just like Massachusetts. Its citizens had all the same questions about this newfangled carbon tax. They didn't buy it. So you know what British Columbia did, and this was under a conservative premier. The conservative premier did send the check back the first month in the 12-month tax collection cycle. People got their rebates, because tax collections can be projected, in advance, and knew that government wasn't going to renege on its promise of revenue neutrality and just use it to fund more programs, something which the polls in British Columbia indicated voters wouldn't go along with. They got their money. They saw that government was going to be truthful on this point. Listen, I just want you to know in closing that I'm the Senate chair here in Massachusetts of the Committee on Children, Families, and Persons with Disabilities. When I'm not working on a carbon tax, I spend all my time arguing the wisdom and the justice of healthy appropriations for helping people with physical, cognitive, and emotional difficulties. I get it, and people in my district get it. I voted for that higher gas tax because I wanted to fund worthy government programs. I'm just saying that in this case, I've decided to make the carbon tax revenue neutral. If I can persuade my colleagues to go along with it at all, and I think I can, I'll have lots of help. There are other legislators already signing up. But I'm going to send the money back for the reasons I've outlined. But I invite your criticism because I know there are alternatives.
I wasn't criticizing. I was making an addendum or an alteration. I was suggesting a checkoff, much as there was a dollar checkoff for presidential candidacy, presidential elections. I was saying that it would facilitate, through laziness on the part of willing taxpayers, to see money channeled back locally at their own discretion. You'd sign your tax return saying, well, you check it and you say, please send my feedback to my local government's receiving agency to use for good purposes for climate and mitigation, prevention, education, and so forth.
Well, then I want to thank you.
I was not saying mandate that the funds go to government. I was saying facilitate it so a responsible use of the money could be used by people who have a further interest in pushing the issue, in promoting the issue, and being altruistic and generous. And I was saying to do it in order to motivate local town government officials and local elected officials to support your endeavor. My belief is that the carbon industry is going to be spreading money around and influencing the legislature. Otherwise, you would have gotten 107 legislators already signed on. But there's opposition for no other reason that they know that there's a lot of money coming from the Koch brothers and so forth that will descend upon this state to block this initiative.
Thank you. I got it. That's an interesting idea. I thank you, sir.
So, thank you for joining us. Now, final statement.
Mine's going to be very brief, and I want to give a shout out, by the way, to MCAN, the Massachusetts Climate Action Network, and its organizer, Amy Ty, because so far as I can tell, she was the one who came up with the idea for this forum tonight, which I've been honored to appear at. So thank you, Amy. And I just want to say to all the audience here in person and in our listening audience that this is a conversation that's just beginning. We really want to structure this taxing pollution notion, this pricing pollution notion in a way that's fair to people regardless of their circumstance, and we know people's, particular the way they make their living, where they live, what they're confronted with day to day, what they do as business people. We know that those circumstances are incredibly diverse. We want to be as responsive as possible, but we want to fashion an effort like the carbon tax that enlists every single person in Massachusetts to do what he or she can do to bring down total pollution. We really just have to do this, and I just hope we have the wisdom to do it very fairly and very well. I think we will. I want to thank my panelists, and I want to thank Tim for providing a stimulating evening tonight.